Thank you for being with us. So this looks like a regular legislative committee meeting, and yet it's not. But it's a very important topic, and I think there's a great list of presenters to take part in this hearing on climate change. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from the conferees. To start with, I will pass the mic to my colleague Eileen from Lawrence for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here at today's climate hearing. This is a historic moment here in the Kansas State House. Despite the fact that climate change is an urgent threat, we have not yet had a hearing in the State House about climate change and about the risks that it pose to Kansans. Today's conferees are going to share really critical perspectives on a variety of the impacts of climate change and the need for resilience. And although, as the chairman said, this is an official hearing, it's my hope that it will spark a conversation here in the State House so that we can finally begin to address climate change. And you all know this, but it's going to address, climate change is going to impact so many different areas that we deal with here in the State House, including agriculture, health, rural revitalization, commerce, so many of our committees. And so it is my sincere hope that today we can kick off this conversation and hopefully soon have a formal hearing here in the State House. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative. So with that, we'll start into the hearing. And just to let you know what the structure will be, each conferee will be given 5 minutes to present, is that correct? And there is a timekeeper out there. I see somebody with a watch. And then following their presentation, we will have 3 minutes, I believe, for Q&A before we go to the next conferee. So our first conferee is Doug Kluck, Executive Director of NOAA. That's what my paper says.
Well, yeah, not quite. My name is Doug Kluck, that's right, but I'm the Regional Climate Services Director for a region about 16 states, north central part of the U.S. Kansas is one of those states. Is it not on? Oh, I guess you got to push it. Okay, see? A little bit about myself. I grew up in Nebraska on a feedlot, not in a feedlot, but on a feedlot. So my background isn't agriculture, but I've lived around it most of my life. So, and a lot of people in agriculture are interested in the subject too, so I've done some speaking. However, I'm going to refer most of my agricultural questions, if there are any, to Mary Knapp, who's in the audience here, Assistant State Climatologist. So anyway, I'm a Regional Climate Services Director for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and more specifically, the National Centers for Environmental Information. Basically a place that is a data warehouse. Not that you need to know that, but it's where all the climate data in the world gets stored. Today I'd like to talk briefly about, mainly about the science of climate change and a few implications for Kansas. I've supplied a slide deck, and apparently when I printed my slide deck out, half of it came out, and I just discovered that today. So if you ask me questions in the back half, I'll have to see the slide. Most of what I'm going to say, maybe all of what I'm going to say, is pretty much focused or comes from a report called the Fourth National Climate Assessment, NCA4, and that's available online. If you type in National Climate Assessment 4, you're going to find everything there is. You can download anything and everything from that, even presentations on every single chapter. Which there are quite a few chapters. The NCA4 is a congressionally mandated assessment that involves 300 plus authors about every 4 years, 13 agencies, states, tribal academics, altogether, lots of people involved in that. The goal of the report is to provide, quote, to provide for development and coordination of a comprehensive and integrated United States research program which will assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced natural processes for global change. It's really focused on the United States, as opposed to the IPCC report, which is global. So, one of the things that was produced in parallel, I guess I'll say, with the National Climate Assessment was a state climate summary for every single state. Again, if you want to Google state climate summaries, you will find the website, and you can find more information on other states. But for Kansas, the key points that came out of that are, number one, average annual temperature has increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the early 20th century, with greater warming in the winter and spring than in the summer and fall. The number of very cold nights has been much below average since about 1990. Under high emission pathways, that means a lot of more greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere. Historically unprecedented warming is projected by the end of the 21st century. Number two, precipitation has varied greatly from year to year in this region of transition from humid conditions in the east to semi-arid conditions in the west. Projected increases in winter precipitation and decreases in the summer precipitation may result in both beneficial and negative impacts. The agricultural economy of Kansas makes the state vulnerable to droughts, heat waves, and several of which have occurred in the 30s and the 50s in recent years. Projected increases in temperature may increase the intensity of future droughts. The frequency of wildfire occurrence and severity is also projected to increase in Kansas. Some of the other National Climate Assessment for report findings are by the late 21st century under, again, high emission scenarios in which a lot, again, greenhouse gases are put into the atmosphere, will increase the number of 100-degree plus days by 40 to 70 days per year across Kansas. Lower emission scenarios call for 20 to 40 days on average of increase of 100-degree temperatures. The number of heavy rainfall events have increased since the 1950s. The trends in flood magnitude, this is just what we've measured so far, not saying is this part of climate change or not, but flood magnitudes have increased since the 50s. The trend in 20-year precipitation frequency and other frequencies like 100-year events, things like that, you hear about rainfall events, have also increased with every season. Winter has seen the largest gain. Generally, high emission scenarios show increased precipitation in the winter and spring across much of Kansas. There are indications of less precipitation in western Kansas in the summer, and relatively, according to the model output, relatively insignificant changes across the state in the fall. It's important to note that warmer temperatures increase evaporation and evapotranspiration. So that means that with precipitation, if it even stays average or even rises a little bit, drier conditions could prevail through increased evaporation because of warmer temperatures. I just want to point out that there are several other key messages that are in the report for the southern plains. Kansas gets lumped in with Oklahoma and Texas, by the way, in terms of the southern plains. So there are several key messages for that region that were put into the, testimony that was passed out to most of you folks. I also made sure that you at least had a briefing document that came from the National Climate Assessment. I just got those Saturday, so that's the short version. There's a lot more to that. Like I said, online. If you're interested in more things like that, I can find them for you. Thank you. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kluck. And timekeeper, don't start his 3-minute Q&A yet. Because we have kind of a mixed committee, I think it'd be appropriate for all committee members to briefly introduce themselves. Some are legislators, but some are not. So let's start over on this side of the room. Representative Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Cox. I'm in my second term in the State House. I come from Shawnee, Kansas, and represent parts of Shawnee, Lenexa, and Lake Rieber. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Eileen Horn. I represent the 10th District, which is the southeast part of Lawrence and the southeast part of Douglas County, also in my second term, and happy to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Cathleen Bascom, and I'm the Bishop of the Episcopal Church of Kansas, which is the eastern third of the state. And I office here in Topeka, and I'm happy to be part of this. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Representative Annie Kuether. I'm the ranking Democrat on the House Energy and Utilities Committee, and this is my 24th year.
And I'm Don Hineman, a 12th year legislator from western Kansas. My district is actually bigger than the entire state of Connecticut and does not contain a single Walmart.
I'm Senator Marci Francisco. I represent the 2nd District, which is now much of Lawrence, Lecompton, and almost all of Jefferson County. I'm serving in my 4th term in the Senate, 16th year, and I serve as the ranking member of both the Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee and the Senate Utilities Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Reese Shu. I represent the 25th District, which is, my house is basically on the state line and the county line between Wyandotte and Johnson, just to give you an idea. I'm in my 1st term. This is my 2nd year, and I serve on the Agricultural Committee, which I hear is an unnatural fit for a young immigrant from Johnson County. But it is now one of the few committees in this building that actually touch on natural resources, which is why I wanted to be on it.
My name is Melissa Cheatam, and I live in Overland Park, Kansas, and I'm here as a parent and an advocate for action on climate change. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Thank you and welcome. My name is Randall Hardy. I live in Salina. I'm a 1st-term senator. The Senate district includes all of Saline County and the northern half of Dickinson County, which includes the cities along I-70. And I participate on the Utilities Committee in the Senate.
Thank you. Close. My name is Jeremy Johnson. I am a county commissioner for Crawford County, so I live in Pittsburgh. I obviously am not a legislator, but I appreciate being asked to be here because climate change and sustainability are important to me, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
All right, committee members, thank you all for the introduction and thank you for volunteering to be part of this project. So now we'll go to the Q&A for Mr. Kluck. Committee members, questions for our conferee. Representative Shu and then Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doug, you say in your testimony that the frequency and severity of wildfires may be increased. This might be hyperbolic at this current point, but can you see eventually in the future seeing something like what happened in Australia, which is just on mass scale devastation from wildfire?
Yeah, it's hard to comment because I don't know the landscape of Australia that well. Okay. However, we do know what's happened in the western part of the U.S. and a lot of increase in wildfire acres per year, that kind of thing. Part of that is not 100% climate change necessarily. Part of it is land use change, people moving to places that are more impactful. And measures that have been used in the past to control wildfires or not control wildfires are all part of an equation. Climate change it may allow longer periods of drought. The critical times mainly in Kansas are spring and fall when things dry out and die, and you have a lot of dry fuels to burn. So I think in the document it shows that in real time, not looking forward, but in the past so many years, there has been an increase in the plains for wildfires. I'm not going to blame that 100% on climate change. Like I said, climate change is part of a lot of equations.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Kluck, for being here. You gave us some good information on temperatures. I'm not expecting you to have this today, but I'm wondering if your office could also provide information on temperature increase during the evenings or at night. And my understanding is that may have even a more dramatic impact on agriculture than increases in temperature during the day.
Yeah, so the basics of all plants are that they need a resting period, and part of that is coolness at night. And so I'm forgetting the word for it, respiratory. They need to breathe, right? And if temperatures are too high at night, all plants suffer in some way. Now, corn, soybeans, other planted crops, agricultural crops, suffer in a similar way. They're more susceptible during certain times of the year, of course. So, yes, it's logical to assume that climate change will have an impact on those various crops going into the future.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Ms. Cheatam. Mr. Kluck, thank you for being here. I like I said, I have 2 children, ages 5 and 8, and sometimes when I see things on the news like the Australian fires, you almost feel like it's too late. Have we wasted too much time? And I wondered if you could talk about the difference in expected impacts if we don't do anything and keep going on business as usual versus if we decide after this hearing today that we want to take bold action. Can we still change our trajectory? How much worse will it be if we do nothing?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, this would be more my opinion than anything else. But what we have now are several options in terms of how we deal from a mitigation, in other words, reducing greenhouse gases, as well as how we think about adapting, right? We have a lot of options, I think, on the table in terms of doing that. There are other experts that have answers to how many or what those things actually are. I think in the future, if, say, we do nothing at all, ignore the issue, I think we'll have less options in that case. And less options means we're going to have to go one road, and it's probably going to be more expensive, I'm guessing, than any other. So, and of course the effects, we'll know the effects are deleterious to our lifestyle and such. So I think, so from a lifestyle point of view, I would say our options are broader now than they will be in the future. We may only have a few options in the future when it comes to how we deal with these issues.
All right, thank you. We need to move on now. Thank you, Mr. Kluck. It appears to me already that each of these presentations is going to be kind of like a movie trailer, just a little sample. I think we could spend the whole entire 2 hours with Mr. Kluck. So we'll do what we can do, and each of you can approach these folks individually later on. Our next presenter is Representative Jason Probst from Hutchinson. Jason?
Thank you. Thank you, committee, for having me here today. So I was asked to come share the findings of the 2019 Special Committee on Natural Resources. We took a pretty deep dive into the flooding that we had throughout Kansas this year. And in the spirit of time, I'll go just through some of the high points. But I do want to point out, if you want to, as the chairman mentioned, if you want to take a deeper dive into this, go to the committee's website through the legislature. All of the testimony is there, and there's a lot of good information about rainfall trends, what we've seen in the state, as well as what we saw as far as flood level capacity at the lakes throughout the state. So we met on November 12, 2019 to hear about kind of what we saw in flooding and what the effects were, and maybe come up with a few recommendations. The first thing we really heard was that it was the wettest year on record. So just a few examples. Yates Center's normal May rainfall is 5.54 inches, and in 2019 it was 21.93. Winfield had the same thing. It was about 5.83 inches, and in May it was 19.75. And that trend was pretty spread out throughout the state. We saw that a lot in south central Kansas and a lot in the eastern part of the state. The Adjutant General reported that more than 200 miles of compromised levees existed throughout Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, and that was a contributing factor to some of the flooding. The State Emergency Operations Center, which was activated during this flooding, lasted 65 days between April 29th and July 1st, and that's the longest that has been active in place to address this flooding. Well, not the longest since 1993. And if you remember the floods in 1993, these floods in some areas exceeded what we saw then. As to cost, he did talk about the need to kind of upgrade the SEOC operations and to install more river gauges throughout the state so that we would have a better sense of where flooding was occurring and what we might expect. The Department of Agriculture, Water Resources stated that they had 287 National Flood Insurance Program claims totaling $3.78 million. but it's important to note that only about 10% of properties that exist in a floodplain participate in an FIP program. So there are a lot of probably other insurers or other mechanisms, and I'll take an aside. I know in Reno County we had an issue with an area of homes that couldn't get flood insurance unless we spent an incredible amount of money improving the levee and raising it about 2 feet. And the homeowners in that area had to actually form a district to kind of offset the cost and share the cost for everybody in that neighborhood for flood insurance. Otherwise, they were going to be uncovered. The KDHE Bureau of Water explained there were a number of streams and rivers contaminated by flooding. A lot of this was wastewater treatment plants that overflowed because of all the water and had emergency releases into rivers. And 14 communities had boil water advisories, and several other communities had to have water shipped in because they could not use their drinking water. The Kansas Water Office reported that sedimentation was a real issue this year. Tuttle Creek had about 475% more sedimentation than normal. Again, I'll take another aside. If you go to the information I pointed to at the committee's website, you will see aerial photos of Tuttle Creek at normal flood stage and what it was at the max capacity, and it's remarkable. It about tripled in size because it was holding so much water. John Redmond, which I might point out, we recently spent about $20 million to dredge, has basically lost all of the capacity that we gained from that because they had about 370% more sedimentation than a normal year. That agency outlined the need to improve stream gauging networks, also the State Emergency Operations Center, more and better GIS mapping, and at a cost of about $200,000 per basin to evaluate all the drainage basins in the state so that we can maybe get a better understanding of what we'll see in the future. Wildlife and Parks came in and testified and said that aside from some damage they suffered from camping areas, one of the big issues they had was reduction in visitors. They normally have about 2 million, they had about 2 million fewer visitors in 2019 than they normally see, and their average revenue is about $1 million a month during peak season, and June is at the height of that. It's about 1.5 million, and in June 2019, their revenues were down $1 million, and they're still down the rest of the year. And as a fee-funded agency, they're largely fee-funded, so that's a big issue with them. The Corps of oh, it's over. I wasn't even looking at that. I thought I had this pretty narrowed down. All right. The other thing, I guess, just real quick pointing, the Corps of Engineers came in and talked about some of what we're going to see. We had 45 levees that overtopped, 20 in the Kansas City district. This is not the Tulsa district. We have 2 districts that cover the state. They overtopped, 45 topped and breached, and 21 topped but didn't breach. And early estimates, it'll cost $1.1 billion to repair those. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you, Representative. I'm going to use the chairman's prerogative to ask the first question. What's the status of the reservoirs in the eastern half of the state today? Are they still full? Are we set up for a repeat if we get heavy rain?
At the time, I don't know about right now, but I know at the time of the hearing in November, they were still at or near flood stage. That's actually one of the issues that we had before. We were still holding water in these reservoirs from March, from the snow melt, that we couldn't release because of the control point further downstream. So at the time we got our rain, we were still full, and my understanding is we're still set at a higher level, so if we get another rain event in the spring, we're probably going to be in the same situation.
Okay, well, if we could send that rain out west, we can use it out. It's another issue. Yes, Reverend Bascom.
Thank you so much. I have some history from Iowa, and I'm wondering about the uniqueness of grasslands here and what kind of initiatives are coming out to restore prairie and wetlands as preventative, both for flooding events, whether it's private land or public lands, whether that's kind of something the Water Office should look at. And just, I didn't get that question last time, but carbon sequestration, grasslands are one of the most cost-effective scalable ways of also dealing with that. So can you speak to that at all?
A little bit. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I do know that there are programs like the RAPS program and the watershed districts all have good programs to try to encourage practices that both control runoff and reduce sedimentation. That's probably about the extent of what I know on that. But I do know there's some programs out there to try to, and largely run by KDHE and some of the watersheds.
And is it considered a way too to deal with sedimentation, some that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And RAPS.
RAPS, yeah.
Thank you.
Representative Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When speaking with General Taffanelli recently, he had mentioned that the flooding level, we were talking about the damage it did, which you mentioned, but that had we not had it, was it the 93 floods? Had we, the improvements we made in response to that, had we not made those, he said that the flooding damage would be far more catastrophic across the state, in multiple states, than even it was back then. Did you guys discuss any of that or talk about kind of the, had we not even caught up to where we were post that, how much more damaging it would have been?
Yeah, there was talk about kind of what they learned in '93, and there was a lot of talk about looking at what we can do and what we can learn now and try to evaluate the basins, use LiDAR imaging to try to understand the topography better, and moving forward trying to make those improvements, both on the major infrastructures but also on like watershed dams to try to control the water flow at smaller points. So I guess there's one, it'll be expensive, but one thing is like every time we have a flood event like this, we'd have to continue to upgrade our infrastructure to anticipate the next flooding event.
I'm going to allow one more quick question. Representative
It's
Kuether.
quick, it's not going to be a question, but Senator Francisco and I also served on the committee, and we did a full recommendation for fully funding the water plan, because we were hearing about things that needed to be addressed, and all of it, if you fund the water plan, it can be addressed. So we have made a recommendation for full funding, and I think that's important to know and hope that we can push and get that.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
One more.
A very quick follow-up also, we know that we would have to provide funding to wildlife parks and tourism to be able to match funds, federal funds, if we want to do any state or remediation to those park areas.
All right, thank you, Jason. Our next presenter is Fred Iutzi. Is that close?
Iutzi, yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, from the Land Institute in Salina. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. You are a sight for sore eyes. This is a good thing that you're doing here. Thank you. I am Fred Iutzi. I'm president of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. I'm an agronomist, certified crop advisor. Before I became a first-generation Kansan, I was on an eighth-generation family farm in Illinois, in the land of Lincoln, and so the most important way I can introduce myself is as the great-great-great-great-grandnephew of Abraham Lincoln's grammar school teacher. It's a true story. We're required to say that when we go around the country. So, Mr. Chairman, in the beginning there was grass here. After the shallow primordial sea retreated over 1 million years ago, and the prairie broke out across the landscape, a diversity of deep-rooted perennial grasses and forbs that over millennia built up the deep fertile soils that sequestered carbon, that resulted in the clean water that we enjoy and the atmospheric carbon balance. Over the last century or two, we've been engaging in a planetary and a state-scale mass transfer project here. We've come in and busted up the grassland. We've replaced perennials with annuals, plants that live only one season before dying and having to be replaced. We've had a careful eye to stewardship, but the hardware that we're using consigns us to shallow root systems that put a limited amount of carbon in the soil and field operations that stir up the soil expose organic matter to oxidation, send the carbon into the air. At the same time, we've been tapping into millions of years of buried sunshine here in the form of fossil fuels, more of a carbon flux into the air. And so there's nothing exotic or surprising about what's happening now, about the science that Mr. Kluck reported on here. It's the consequences of this mass transfer project here. The good news is that we can turn this around. We want to be interested in doing that in agriculture as in other areas of human endeavor because we have some impacts that are already manifesting themselves and more coming. As was discussed, our rainfall here actually on the first glance is going to stay approximately the same on an annual basis. What that may belie, however, is that the pattern of rainfall is going to change. We're going to get more of our annual precipitation in pounding, inundative rain events that cause soil erosion, allow more rainfall to run off rather than being absorbed into the soil and being available for crops, resulting in more soil erosion. It's going to be coupled with, as Mr. Kluck mentioned, an increase in extremely hot days that will both cause losses to yield due to increased unproductive respiration at night. It will cause heat stress during the day and will sort of mess up pathogen and disease cycles in ways that may not always be favorable to us. So we have some impacts coming to yield stability, to profitability, and maybe worst of all to soil that is our patient wealth that was built up over the millennia. But in the beginning there was grass, and perhaps in the future there can be grass. If we can perennialize our agriculture like the prairie was perennial, if we can diversify it like the prairie was diverse, maybe we can reverse this net flow of carbon, and maybe agriculture can go from being a net source of carbon emissions to a net sink. That'll help mitigate the effects of climate change overall, and will also adapt us to those effects that we're already locked into by increasing soil health and ecosystem functionality. Now, we can do this with the perennial agriculture that we have now in part. I'm speaking of permanent pasture and rangeland. Well-managed permanent pasture and rangeland offers most of the same ecosystem services that a prairie does, particularly when it comes to carbon sequestration. And so part of our response needs to be to increase the acreage of this kind of agriculture as much as economic conditions and the situation overall will permit. But we have to go further than that. 70% of all the calories that humans subsist on in the food system globally, directly or indirectly, come from grain crops. All of those of us who have been involved in grain crop agriculture are awfully fond of corn and wheat and soybeans, and it's more than affection. Grain crops have an ongoing need in a healthy, sustainable human diet. And so that's why part of the solution to climate change in agriculture needs to be to perennialize grain crop agriculture. For the first time in the 10,000 years humans have been farming on this or any other continent. The Land Institute and a network of more than 50 research collaborators worldwide have recently released the world's first two perennial grain crops. Kernza perennial grain, a relative of wheat in North America, and perennial rice in China and Southeast Asia. These are baby steps in their early days. There are decades more work before Kernza reaches yields approaching those of wheat. It's a specialty crop now. It needs to be grown into a major crop. We need more than just a couple crops. We need the agronomy and the agroecological know-how to grow them and grow them in diversity. And so there's a lot of work ahead, but we now have proof of concept. And so I'll give credit where credit is due also to people who are practicing conscientious no-till agriculture with the grain crops we have, like my parents back in Western Illinois, like many of the people in this room, people who are practicing good organic agriculture. We need as much of these practices as we can get. Ultimately, there will be no substitute for vegetating the landscape again with the same kind of vegetation that built the soils to start with. And so we need policy directed at increasing immediately the acreage of permanent pasture and rangeland, and at fully funding research and development for perennial grain crops, so we can have this critical technology, not 50 years in the future, but maybe a few decades in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you. I was happy to hear you mention no-till agriculture as a farmer myself. Many of us have transitioned to that and are committed to no-till as a way to sequester carbon to some extent, build organic matter, and we see it on our own farmland that's been in no-till for 5, 6, 7 years. Organic matter content is going up, and the side benefit, of course, is you increase the water holding capacity of the land, either with grass or with no-till. And if rainfall is going to be less predictable, maybe the same amount, but not optimal in timing, if you can hold on to it in the soil, then that's a big benefit. Questions for Representative Horn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for being here. So many of us serve on the agriculture committees and work closely with the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Have you seen any policies that other states have done to support perennial agriculture, or anything that we could look to replicate here in Kansas?
Thank you. So the state of Minnesota is probably the one to look to first. They have a combination of policies there where they have leveraged, for example, their wellhead protection legislation and implementation process to incentivize perennial agriculture in several forms around municipal water supply wellheads. They've gotten involved in other ways in farmer adoption of perennials, and they've also directly funded research and development for perennial grain crops and other novel perennial crops at their universities.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for coming to fellow Salinian. The question I have is, given the state of affairs as it exists now, and the perennials are still a ways out, no-till farming is not universal in the western part of the state, which is the part of the state I care deeply about. I was curious of your take on how both the irrigated farming and dryland farming might be impacted in the coming years, given the change in temperature, and even though the precipitation isn't likely to change as much.
Yeah, thank you. We know that our irrigated grain farming in the western part of the state is the most on the agronomic margins and the economic margins, the most at risk under current conditions of any agriculture in the state. And so I would say it puts grain farming in those regions of the state in great peril. It's a virtual certainty that over time it'll become impossible from a risk standpoint and a profitability standpoint to produce grain crops without something in the equation changing here.
Committee, further questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Iutzi.
Thank you.
Our next conferee will be Rachel Myslivy, close, from the Climate and Energy Project.
Myslivy, thank you. You did a good job. Representative Hineman, Senator Francisco, and committee members, and everyone here today, I want to thank you for your time and consideration about the important issues we're addressing. The connections between climate change and public health are coming to the forefront as leading public health organizations like the Centers for Disease Control, the American Public Health Association, the American Lung Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, and many others are calling for action on climate change as a public health crisis. In July of 2019, the Kansas Health Institute released a policy brief on health and climate change in Kansas, citing climate change as a substantial concern for Kansas, particularly considering our agricultural industry. The report addresses specific concerns that will affect Kansas and that are affecting Kansans, including increased rates of cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and other chronic conditions, expanded allergy seasons, worse asthma, and increases in vector-borne illnesses. Inspired by these public health calls for action and informed by the Kansas Health Institute's report, The Climate and Energy Project and our Kansas Wealth Partners, as well as several organizational sponsors, came together to release the Kansas Climate and Health Declaration in 2019. It's also in your packets. The Kansas Climate and Health Declaration draws attention to the specific impacts of climate change on public health in Kansas, orienting around 4 principles. Climate disruption impacts the lives, health, and economic well-being of Kansans. Climate change is a major public health concern in Kansas. Those least responsible will be the most impacted and the least able to adapt. However, solutions exist that build resilience, economic opportunities, and healthy communities. Each section of the declaration includes specific public health concerns for Kansas. An overview of those impacts include Kansans will experience increases in cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and other chronic conditions according to current projections. Longer periods of pollen production will worsen asthma symptoms and respiratory diseases, worsen asthma symptoms, leading to longer, more intense allergy seasons. EPA data reports that in Kansas City, the Kansas City area, the ragweed pollen season increased by 25 days in 1995 to 2015. We know that warmer temperatures and changes in the geographic ranges of ticks and mosquitoes will increase vector-borne diseases such as Lyme disease and West Nile virus. CDC research indicates that tick-borne diseases are 20 times more likely in Kansas, and mosquito-borne diseases were 35% higher in 2016 than in 2004. Increased heat wave intensity and frequency, increased humidity, degraded air quality, and reduced water quality will increase public health risks. Hospitalizations due to heat-related illnesses range from a low of 57 in 2004 to a high of 180 in 2011. In that same year, 37 Kansans died of heat-related causes. The impacts on mental health include increased stress, depression and anxiety, strained social and community relationships, increases in aggression, violence and crime, and increases in trauma, shock, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Farmers, ranchers, construction workers, first responders, and military personnel are among the first to experience the effects of climate change. As I'm sure many of you have heard, the suicide rate for farmers in northwest Kansas is up 64%, which is higher than the national average. Climate change affects everyone, but some more than others. We know that those least responsible will be the most impacted and least able to adapt. Vulnerable populations will bear the greatest burden. My colleague Richard Mabion will elaborate on this point in his next presentation, and the testimonies that follow his testimony showcase potential solutions for rapid, immediate climate action for our health and the future of our state. The American Academy of Pediatrics states that tackling climate change could be the greatest public health opportunity of the 21st century. However, they urge that failure to take prompt, substantive action would be an act of injustice to all children. I urge you now to take to heart the impacts of climate change on the public health of all Kansans. Let this information drive your efforts to address climate change as a primary threat to our state. Take bold, comprehensive action to reduce emissions and build resilience. We need to reduce the risks of climate disruption to safeguard the future of our state. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rachel. Committee, questions for our presenter? Jeremy.
Thank you. So as someone that oversees a local health department, do you have recommendations for the types of things that they might be doing to help with this mitigation that you're describing?
I do. Actually, local health departments can be the heroes of the climate change crisis. They're on the front lines of what's happening in local communities. And the American Public Health Association recently put out about a 400-page report called Climate Change and Health Equity, a guide for local health departments. And that report is extensive, and it covers in very easy to understand terms and easy to educate the public what climate change is and how it's impacting our health in various different ways, health equity. And it goes into this very lot of detail about each of the different things. So it'll say what health departments can do, what other health departments have already done, et cetera. And they really break it into 3 categories: assessment and surveillance, like tracking increases of Lyme disease, for example, intersectoral collaboration, so working with maybe the wildlife and parks in their area to try to help educate people on Lyme disease, and then community education and engagement. So it's a really amazing report. report, very helpful. And the Climate and Energy Project has actually been doing outreach to all of the health departments in the state, along with Mary Knapp, the state climatologist, on just these issues.
Good question. Further questions from the, yes, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm certainly concerned about the increase in asthma that we've seen in the state. So I'm understanding that there's two parts of that. One is the emissions from electrical generation, transportation, agriculture. The other would be pollen outputs, and that maybe increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So are we getting 2 for 1 if we can reduce fossil fuel generation and then also have an impact on that pollen production?
That's a wonderful question, and it made me smile, because anything that we can do to reduce emissions is also going to have positive benefits for the community. It's a win-win situation. So if we're reducing emissions and we're taking action on climate, all of those activities make for healthier communities. They make for more livable communities with healthier and cleaner water, air, all of it. So there's really no reason not to.
Committee, further questions? All right, seeing none. Rachel, thank you. Our next presentation will be from Richard Mabion, Kansas City, Kansas, NAACP. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess you could say in my life, I'm really a freedom fighter from back in the 60s, 70s. And because of 9/11 knocking small businesses out, I was one of those small businesses that got knocked out and had to regroup. And in the process of regrouping, I discovered the environmental world. I wasn't an environmental person before then, but when I saw what happened in 2005 in Katrina in New Orleans, the engineering of me, the social engineering of me said that we could not allow that to happen in the city that we live in Kansas City, Kansas. And one day we could have some kind of, I knew it wouldn't be a hurricane, but we could have like a tornado that could cut off the portion of town that I was trying to work in from the rest of the city. And how the heck were we going to have people up there that didn't have the kind of leadership to make sure that people have a way to be cared for? That was a pitiful sight for a person who came through the civil rights movement, who had been able to do the kind of things we had been able to do in the cities. And then I got my lesson in St. Louis, living and seeing that happen. So I got interested in it, discovered a guy named David Corton who wrote a book called The Great Turning. And in his book, he said that leadership for the world to come will come from the people who have suffered the most injustices in life. And as soon as I saw that, I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I knew exactly who he was talking about. And I didn't necessarily see that as being just people of color. I saw it as being in low-income communities, because those people have had to, even poor farmers and all those folks have had to learn how to survive. And the kind of circumstance that we're going into that everybody's so fearful of is going to require people to know how to survive. But I knew that if a person of color, a black person, did not get involved in this environmental movement and learn it from the inside out, and be able to come back into the community and teach people what they had learned that would work, that when it came time for that leadership that David Corton was talking about, as it is now in our inner city, that leadership wouldn't exist. So I took that on in 2006 and ended up becoming the person that was determining why you had such a lack of people of color involved in your environmental world. And from that, I just go from then to now. I'm on my way back out. On my way back out, we discovered a way to be able to bring some economic development into this environmental world from the environmental justice portion. I know that's what I'm here to talk about. But not the environmental justice the way it's been done, but the environmental justice the way it should be done. And so by doing that, this past November, I was able for 2 years to work with 3 local organizations in Kansas City, Kansas, El Centro, EOL, Economic Opportunity Foundation, and Donnelly College. And they were able on their own, I had no name in it, I was just a facilitator, receive a $200,000 grant from the federal government for job training. Why? They're teaching their own clients how to be able to do the environmental service work, how to be able to work at the windmills with solar and all the different talents and skills that they need that they don't have now. If you take a company into the inner city right now to put solar panels on every house there, the people who live there will not get hired. Just that simple, because they don't have the skills. So we went into that program, we got that one going. I see I got a minute left, and I'll throw this out. I think, I'm gonna read, but I think we had a point where the legislators and the decision makers in Kansas need to come help us as far as support is concerned. The money is out there, we know where it is. We just need to have the support when we reach out to get it. Everybody wants to work with the communities. Our problem is when you go up there and I'm just by myself, I'm just that tall, good-looking black man from Kansas. I didn't get all laughing. I'm saying that's the place I'm now. I'm staying out and I'm saying about being able to talk to you in the way we are, because that's where we go from here. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Richard. Committee, questions for the conferee? Representative Kuether.
I don't have a question again, but you bring up a very good point in leadership, because what happened in Houston is a perfect example when the hurricane came. Is a perfect example of what you're going through with leadership, because every elected official at every single level in Houston didn't believe in climate change. So voting matters. But you need to talk to people who you're going to put in those positions, because it was every single level, county, city, state, governor, nobody was promoting any concerns about climate change. So it makes a difference. So leadership is a fine point.
Representative Hugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I've been reading a lot of Ta-Nehisi Coast lately, and then I was wondering if you could help me kind of draw the line a little bit more clearly between maybe historical policy and redlining, and then how that might affect your community as it relates to climate change, and why they are in the places they are that would be most affected by climate change.
Well, first of all, I think that the redlining concerns are concerns of the past. There's no excuse for our low-income communities to be having a redlining problem. We go back to leadership again. Now, I have people who are athletes and entertainers who make more money than thou. What are they doing with that money? Where's the leadership that's addressing them with that money? I have an NAACP that puts on some kind of award ceremony every year. But we have people that need the kind of leadership to take those kind of investments that they're making and turn them into something that's more than trying to live on the government thing. We got an infrastructure problem going on in this country. For about the next 20 years, it's going to have to be replaced. That's going to have to happen in the inner city. I mean, they want to put in new pipes, new wiring, all kinds of things, new streets, new curves. We have a chance that we can get the people to get some type of marketable skills that they can turn this around, and we can get away from people having the skill to get something to eat or get some milk for the babies.
Ms. Cheatam.
You got it that time. Thanks for being here, Richard. I wondered, I know that there's going to be some in this building who will not be convinced to take action on climate change no matter what we say. They won't be swayed by the fact that your community, though least responsible, is most vulnerable. I wondered if you could talk about the ways that some of the things we might do for climate change reasons would have other benefits in your community, even if someone doesn't believe or doesn't care about climate change.
I love it. That was my reason for going into it. I told you I'm a freedom fighter, but what was going on here, when I realized that for us to have a successful greenhouse gas reduction program, it has to be inclusive of all neighborhoods. You can't have it in the county. You can't have it in the good neighborhoods, and then downtown may not do it if they live their life like it is right now. I'd say 85% of the 95% of the people living in the city could care less about a garden. That's a reality. Something that we as an industry should be addressing. So education is what's going to be needed. What's on the flip side of it? When you take people and engage them in a job training program that's involved with environmental services or environmental construction, environmental whatever, you're teaching them something that when they're going home, they're sitting down at that coffee table in the kitchen talking to mama or whoever's in there about, God, I didn't know I could put plastic on my windows, I could do some caulking. They're talking about stuff. That's how you save money, how you learn about this industry. Well, while that conversation's going on in the back room, you got little Johnny. They're listening. So that's preparing the future generation about the concept. It's all about the consciousness of the environmental movement more than it is a piece of paper that you can read. Once it becomes something that's coming from inside, I need to recycle. They don't recycle in the inner city. I need to recycle. Why? Because it's a natural part of it. So that's why, if we would get involved in it, the things that we're doing will have a long-range effect.
All right, Richard, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. Next presenter is Dorothy Barnett from the Climate and Energy Project. Dorothy, you're no stranger to this process, so welcome to the committee.
I am not. Thank you, Representative Hineman, Senator Francisco, and committee members, and our community members. I am filled with joy today to see all of you and to be having this conversation. Before I start my formal remarks, I just want to say we have over 60 high school students here today for Wealth Day. Could please give them a round. We are trying so hard to do right by you. My written testimony covers emission reduction strategies for both the power and transportation sections, but I'm actually going to focus my remarks primarily on decarbonizing the electricity sector as a way to address climate change. At the end of 2018, Kansas had 15.6 gigawatts of installed electricity capacity. Coal made up 30%, gas-fired generation 24%, and wind energy made up 34%. Kansas has 10% more renewables than the global average. The Kansas wind industry is a key factor in our declining carbon emissions, avoiding more than 9 million metric tons of carbon annually. Our power sector emissions have reduced 40% over the last 20 years, primarily due to our investments in wind. Despite a top 10 solar resource with more sunny days than Florida, Kansas has just under 30 megawatts of installed solar power, less than 0.20 of our state's total generation. Wood Mackenzie's fourth quarter solar report projects that utility solar photovoltaics, or PV, capacity will more than double in the next 5 years. Kansas is poised to grow our utility PV market as more cities and businesses prioritize renewable energy. However, if we're going to mitigate emissions and build a more equitable power system that can help our state become more resilient in the face of a changing climate, increasing utility scale renewable energy can't be the only power sector solution that we address. The most recent IPCC report warned that to limit the most severe impacts of climate change, human-caused emissions of carbon will have to fall to zero by 2050. Let me say that again. Our human-caused emissions have to fall to zero in just 30 years. Since CO2 emissions build up in the atmosphere and remain there for centuries, carbon emissions from coal plants need to be cut in half within the next 10 years. We can't rely solely on utility-scale clean energy investments, but we also must need to add distributed generation resources as well, and we must close our remaining coal plants by 2030. The energy world is rapidly changing. Our 100-year-old system designed around big centralized power plants and one-way power flows is grinding against the rise of smaller, cleaner technologies that offer new ways to generate and manage power at the local level. Think solar panels and batteries. Kansans need to be able to make their homes and communities more resilient. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance gives Kansas an F on their 2020 Community Power Scorecard, rating us on things like friendly net metering policies, simplified interconnection rules to encourage distributed generation, requirements for the utilities to include distributed generation in their long-term resource planning, allowing community or shared ownership of renewable energy, even of allowing some communities to choose their own suppliers. We also fail on offering something simple like property assessed clean energy that would allow financing for energy efficiency retrofits and upgrades. For all three of these things, we received a failing grade. If we could use on-site and local resources to optimize our electricity demand, for example, smart homes and smart meters, and allow Kansans to generate some of their own power, we can shift energy demand and store excess power that can be used when it's needed and where it's most needed. The way we have developed energy production is upside down. Utilities are incentivized to suppress the very thing that we should be building, small and medium scale distributed generation and energy efficiency. Increasing equitable access to energy efficiency programs allows Kansans more control over their energy use, it lowers cost, and provides multiple benefits for households, businesses, as well as the environment. For example, if we're adding insulation for a home improves both efficiency and comfort, and if we are increasing the efficiency of manufacturing processes, that can enhance the competitiveness of the plant. And by lowering energy use, all forms of energy efficiency cut pollution, which, as Rachel mentioned, impacts air quality and our health. The current business model does not support the energy system we need to mitigate power sector emissions. We must have leadership at all levels to come together and make this transformational shift. Very quickly, I'm going to address transportation. We are in a space where electrification of vehicles can reduce the transportation emissions. There are several things that we could be doing to help that shift. Things like voluntary EV ready codes for new family homes and expanding our charging infrastructure. EV ready codes are several options where it can be just having the capacity and the wiring of a new home, or it can go all the way down the line to actually have electric vehicle charging stations already in the home when they're being purchased. As we adopt more electric vehicles, it will be important to continue the dialogue around motor fuel taxes versus miles traveled per minute, vehicles per mile traveled, and we're going to have to include adaptation strategies in long-term transportation planning. Fortunately, many of our state leaders recognize the need for planning and for strategies to keep Kansans healthy and resilient. With Governor Kelly's announcement of a state energy plan and her energy office reorganization, the Department of Transportation's new Forward Kansas program, and the Department of Commerce's framework for growth, we feel confident that with leadership and a commitment to take on climate change, we can get there together. So happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Dorothy. Committee? Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just a quick question. Do you think that the need to reduce our dependence on coal is in conflict with the movement to also reduce the prices of electricity by our providers?
So I think there are several things that we could do. We know that we're not fully utilizing our existing coal fleet. We're changing the way that we're balancing power, the way that power is bought and sold on the Southwest Power Pool market. I think that there's opportunities for things like securitization, where we could retire those plants, return some of the savings back to ratepayers, and then also be able to provide for conservation programs like energy efficiency. So I think we're still paying for those coal plants, Senator, even though we're making investments in new generation. If we're going to actually talk about lowering rates, we want to invest in more wind power so that we can lower carbon emissions. But if we're just making investments without retiring existing assets, we're going to have a hard time meeting the need for lower cost.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dorothy, I'm intrigued by the idea of having voluntary EV-ready codes for new family houses. What do you think we need to do in regards to the rest of our building codes and standards statewide?
Boy, you just jumped right into it, didn't you? The press is here, right? If we're going to really get to a place where we're thinking about resiliency and we're thinking about the future, we have to be building for the future. We also have to be thinking about building homes that don't need to be weatherized in 10 years or 15 or 20 years. And so if we can build in energy efficiency on the front end, then we won't have to spend as much money on the back end, and folks won't have to spend as much on their energy efficiency bills. I think that's a perfect topic for the state energy plan to be thinking about. What do we do with our building stock? I know that the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation is starting on a plan to look at weatherization and look at some of those things like building codes. So happy to be a part of that conversation.
Ms. Cheatam.
One of my volunteer roles is as a member of Climate Action KC, which focuses on local climate action in that part of the state, as well as I'm on my municipality's volunteer environmental advisory council. Are there policies that are in place at the state level right now that might be impeding local government's ability to advance some of these clean energy solutions, or things that the legislature could do to encourage local governments to act?
So I think in the northeast part of the state, one of the things I would point to is the differences in solar policies for Missouri and for Kansas. In Missouri, there are often rebates for solar. In Kansas, we add additional charges for solar customers. We're not really thinking about distributed generation as a tool that can build resilience in communities, and so that's one area that I would point you to. Secondly, I understand there's going to be a bill introduced today that would impede local government's ability to deal with single-use plastic as they see fit, and so keeping communities to have the autonomy to build the kind of future they want to see, I think is really important. So making sure that that doesn't really get traction, I think, are the two things I would point you to that immediately we could have a big impact on.
All right, we're out of time for you, so Dorothy, thank you. Our final presenter today is I'm sorry.
Not yet.
Rabbi Moti Rieber. And I'll tell you, Moti was one of the organizers of this event, and I think it's interesting that he's the last presenter. I don't know if that's because he was being gracious, thinking if we ran over, he would be the one that got cut short. Maybe he just wanted to put an exclamation point on the end.
So the last 45 minutes are mine, I think.
You're still at the timekeeper.
Yes. Representative Hineman, Senator Francisco, and members of the committee, I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm very pleased that this is here today. Most of the organizations that are involved in Wealth Day have been in this business for quite some time. My first year badged was 2012. And since that time, the only time we've ever had a climate hearing was about climate denial. Many of you have sat through those hearings. We've never had a serious conversation about climate change in Kansas. The fact that we had to impose upon you to be on this committee is an indication of that. There are other places where this conversation should be held, but it hasn't been. The longer this conversation doesn't get held, the worse the impacts of climate change get, and the less prepared we are to address them, the more expensive they are. I'm hoping that we can have this conversation in front of an authorized committee with legislative responsibilities in the future. So I'm here to talk about resilience. So my role is to present some ideas for us to think about. I'm kind of, like you said, I'm giving a sampler of some ideas for us to think about. The concept of resilience as a climate strategy. Some possible examples, some resources that you can look at. I do include some resources in my written testimony. There's some footnotes there that you can look at. I'll also point some out in my oral testimony. So as we've said before, there's two areas of response to climate change. One is mitigation, which is lowering emissions, and the other one is adaptation, which is dealing with the changes that are already in the pipeline. And even if we stopped putting carbon into the atmosphere today, we would still have repercussions of previous emissions. So adaptation is a vital area in and of itself, and we're using these two terms, adaptation and resilience, kind of interchangeably. And in terms of, as with all kinds of climate planning, Kansas is way behind in terms of thinking about and planning for repercussions that are coming, or that are here already. So in some ways, mitigation is the easy part because a lot of people are pro-clean energy. You can talk to a lot of people about, when you ask them about climate change, they go, I'm from wind farms. That's fine, that's great. But the question is, how do we address the changes that are already, how do we address changes so that Kansas continues to be livable and thriving throughout the 21st century and beyond? So the National Academy of Sciences defines resilience as the ability to prepare for and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. These could be chronic events, such as low levels of water availability, or acute shocks, such as wildfires. So both would count. Understanding Kansas's vulnerability to climate disruption is key to effective planning. So resilience costs money. Our contention is that money that's spent on planning and adaptation in advance, as I'll talk about here, will save money in the long run, in disaster recovery, in rebuilding, and in health spending. Every time we spend on building Kansas's resilience is an investment in the health and well-being of Kansans in a time of climate uncertainty. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but there are funding sources available. Some of them already exist, such as grants from the EPA. Some of them have to be developed, including infrastructure banks or the use of service fees to fund resilience. But all of these things should be considered, and they don't have to come out of the SGF, which is important to know. We consider it vital for the state to develop a climate action plan that, with strong stakeholder and public engagement, that builds resilience considerations into all our future planning. So we should not be doing any planning in Kansas without taking climate impacts into account. So 3 areas that Kansas is particularly vulnerable. There's actually several more, but I'm just giving you these as an example: heat, wildfire, and drought, and talk about some of the policy options available. Leilani, tell me when I have 2 minutes left. Oh, no. No. Okay, I'm going to go. So extreme heat, cool. So some ways that we can deal with that are cool roofs. So reflective covering on roofs will reduce heat sensitivity, increasing tree cover and green spaces. Raising awareness, and this is one that I'm going to say each time, raising awareness and preparing for extreme heat. Planning for, communicating effectively to the public about predictable climate-related emergencies is an essential element in building resilience. Developing messaging, safety during heat events, services available in media channels to communicate those messages. The second area of vulnerability is wildfires. Increased temperatures, drier conditions, and insect outbreaks all lead to more wildfires. Strategies for that include, there's actually a link I gave you which is called Wildfire Preparedness on the Southern Plains, which of course a conference held on the subject. Increasing communications, increasing transparency of funding guidelines, using prescribed fire as a management strategy, and increasing efforts to reduce long-term drought impacts on water availability. And the third one is water deficit and drought. The States at Risk report shows that drought threat is projected to increase in Kansas. But with our reliance of our economy on agriculture, the ability to access water threatened in areas not served by a river aquifer, and an extended drought would be damaging to our economy. Communities can act to be more resilient to drought by employing strategies to conserve water in homes, agricultural and industrial processes, access new water sources, and manage drought on a watershed level. There are usually already some planning in place for chronic events, but some of these strategies, some of these strategies more regularly can help mitigate the impact of climate threats to water supply. We've heard some talk about reclaiming grassland, using native plants, moving away from turf grass, that sort of thing. I would also argue that using water for injection drilling is a disaster, both because it encourages the use of the carbon-intensive fuels, but also because it takes water out of circulation and endangers wells and other water sources. State resilience level planning can focus on state agencies on climate risks and preparedness and can promote collaboration across regions and between the public and private sectors. Colorado is far ahead of us. They've got something called the Colorado Resilience Framework, which I also linked in your, added to the footnotes. Take a look at that. It commits the state to resiliency and sets resilience goals, identifies priority projects, and a team of Colorado state agencies also have a climate action plan. So there's two other areas I want to highlight. I'm actually not going to leave you any time for questions, and I'm doing that on purpose because of Representative Hineman. Building resilience to climate disruption means making sure our residents have access to what they need to thrive and survive, even if the systems that we've been relying on experience intermittence in their reliability. We talked about the energy sector, but it means food, water, and energy. We've talked about the energy sector. Our friend Paul Johnson has been telling me for years that 90% of the fruits and vegetables that are consumed in Kansas are grown elsewhere. Commodity crops are an important part of the Kansas economy, but they don't feed our people, at least directly. If we rely on California or Mexico to produce our produce, there is drought, then we don't have fruits and vegetables. Paul says that it would take 150,000 acres of our 22 million acres of crop production to produce 100% of our basic produce needs. We know that irrigation is available as well for that. Federal farm bills tend to dictate focus on commodity crops, so fully funding conservation programs, so moving some of our resources to produce for consumption, for local consumption, would be an important part of building resilience. I just want to say a word here, and I'm actually supposed to do the moral piece, which is always the end, up against the time. It is a core element of the faith traditions that make up Kansas Interfaith Action that we are to be stewards of creation. I know that's something that everyone here understands. It's a very important part of Kansas ideology, really. For the past 30 years, we've known that our reliance on fossil fuels is causing lasting damage to the very livability of our planet, to humans and other species, and we've done precious little about it. In Kansas, we rarely ever even use the word climate change in this building, except in a dismissive way. It's hard for me to put into words how irresponsible and how immoral that approach is. Climate is a justice issue. The people who have the least responsibility for causing the problem and have the fewest resources to deal with it are affected the worst. We have two choices. We can continue to pretend that the problem doesn't exist, or that it's not that bad, or that somebody else will solve it, or we can take the steps that we need to take that are well within our capacity to take to address both the causes and effects of human-caused climate disruption. If we choose not to act, we are subjecting our friends and neighbors, our fellow Kansans, our fellow human beings, all of God's creation, to suffer the consequences of our actions on their own. We're spoiling the Creator's gift. But if we choose to act, we can act swiftly and with purpose, and we can build a world that continues to give all of us what we need to survive and thrive. It is our choice, and I hope we start to make the right one. Thank you very much. I want to thank the committee for giving us their lunch hour. I appreciate your concern and your interest in this issue. I want to thank the Conferees, some of whom came from miles away to share with us. I want to thank the people who came. I think you can see that there's a lot of interest in this issue. Hopefully this is the first of a long series of conversations about this issue as we finally start to grapple it. Climate rally, second floor rotunda in about 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Moti, thank you. That was a very passionate exclamation point. Thank you for that. I do want to thank all of the conferees and also our timekeeper, Leilani. Your cards would be very handy in a regular committee. And committee members, thank you as well. Thank you.